I want to begin this presentation on evolutionary trees, uh, talking about this idea Charles Darwin provided regarding the diversity of life as one that could be represented in the form of a tree with a trunk and branches, and then more branches emerging from the branches below. His thought was that if all of life on Earth had evolved from a single ancestral species, then over time, changes could be acquired, and then those changes could be passed to following generations. And so, for example, when you look at this number one on the tree, that would have been the ancestral species to all of life on Earth, and then over time, a change would have appeared in a population of these organisms coming from the ancestral one, and then those changes could be passed on to the following generations. Also, as time went by, some individuals may acquire a different type of change and others different type of change, and that would eventually lead to the different characteristics that you see in living things today. That was Charles Darwin's reasoning. And of course, without the knowledge we now have about genetic variation, the heritability of some of these traits that organisms can acquire through the process of random mutations, for him it was a little bit challenging to explain how these changes could have accumulated over time as he was framing his theory of evolution by the process of natural selection. So let's dive into the idea of evolutionary trees and talk about what these are. An evolutionary tree is going to be a hypothesis, and we're going to be seeing many of these trees not only in the current class Bio 212, but also in Bio 213. And these are going to be hypotheses that provide an explanation as to how a group of organisms may be related by means of a shared common evolutionary history. The reason I emphasize the point of being a hypothesis is that these arrangements of branches on an evolutionary tree are going to be constantly the subject of revision as new data is provided by scientists who work in the area of evolutionary biology. What you're going to be seeing in the tree are going to be homologies. Homologies are going to be derived traits. What I mean by derived will be a new characteristic that has emerged, and a species that has this particular characteristic can then pass the characteristic to the species that are hypothesized to have descended from this one that has acquired a change. So homologies are going to be characteristics that are going to be shared by many different taxa, many different taxonomic groups that share a hypothesized common ancestor. And what you're going to see also on these trees are going to be precisely the taxa, the taxonomic groups. Many trees are going to be depicting specific species and how they can be related through evolution from a common ancestor. However, you can also see trees, and we will see trees that will be depicting groups of organisms at the level of genus, also at the level of class or order or family, and sometimes even phylum, kingdoms, and domains. Evolutionary trees are going to be built looking for these homologies at the levels of molecular biology, differences or similarities in terms of DNA, proteins, also anatomical data. Anatomical can be gross morphology, like meaning like large characteristics, but also small characteristics that can only be detected through meticulous, careful, detailed examination of organisms. And so all of this evidence that is going to suggest organisms have similarities that are the result of a common evolutionary history, or similarities that are evident in the morphology, the physical appearance, or proteins or DNA, are going to enable scientists to build these evolutionary trees, these hypotheses. There are two kinds of evolutionary trees we're going to be seeing in this class as we progress throughout the quarter. Some are going to be described as phylogenetic trees, and others are going to be known as cladograms, referring specifically to how evolutionary is hypothesized to have played a role in the similarities that are depicted in one of these trees. And so to give you an idea for what these trees look like, let's take a look at this example that appears also in chapter 22. By the way, this tree seems like there was a windstorm that came and blew it over. All right. And so this is going to be the trunk on the left-hand side, and then the branches, which on a tree would be growing upwards towards sunlight. In this case, they're actually going sideways. And that is okay. You should not be worried that this tree is lying sideways. This tree could have been represented also in more of a vertical arrangement, as you would expect in a tree. That doesn't matter. What matters is going to be the groupings that you're going to see, the nested patterns I described on my previous slide, you can notice on a phylogenetic tree. So take a look, for example, at this tree, and you're going to notice that there is a number 1 here. This number 1 or branch point is going to be also representing an ancestral species. This will be the ancestor to all of the taxa, all of these groups of organisms you see depicted in the branches of the tree. From this branch point, you will notice that a group of organisms diverges, and this is going to be what we call an outgroup, because it's going to be the most different, the most dissimilar group of organisms compared to everything else you have on the tree. And the way it becomes more dissimilar is that all of these other traits or characters or heritable characteristics, there are so many different ways we can call these characteristics you see right here, those are not going to be present in this group of animals known as the lungfishes. So what we see in this tree is going to be a hypothesis of how members of the vertebrates are going to be related to one another. So the lungfishes is going to be a group of fish that don't have, for example, digits, that is going to be fingers or toes on their limbs. And so this notch you see right here saying that we have digit-bearing limbs would have been a derived trait, a new characteristic that was not present in this common ancestor to all of the vertebrates you see here in this illustration. So what you read in this tree is that it is hypothesized that from this common ancestor, some descendants were able to acquire this characteristic. It would have had to be the result of a mutation or group of mutations. And from this point on, number 2, which is a node, which is going to be a point of divergence, all organisms are going to have, all organisms in this tree are going to have limbs with digits. And that is, again, toes or fingers. And so what we can say is that for all of these animals known as the tetrapods, tetra means 4, pods means foot, literally, but it could be arms or legs. For all of the tetrapods, you can expect to see toes in their limbs, digits in their limbs. And so amphibians, mammals, lizards, crocodiles, ostriches, they all have this characteristic. But notice again that it's this point of divergence from this common ancestor, most recent common ancestor to all of the tetrapods. Some remained pretty much the same way, but others acquired a different change. From this point of divergence, from this common ancestor to all of the taxa on this tree, there was a group of organisms that acquired another change, and this is going to be the amnion. The amnion is a particular sac you notice in eggs with a shell. Eggs with a shell don't need to develop underwater. The eggs of amphibians, like salamanders, frogs, toads, need to develop underwater because they don't have a shell and they will dry out. But with the advantage of this amnion, this special sac or membrane, all of the organisms that can produce this type of an egg with an amnion and a shell can have the advantage of allowing for those eggs to develop exposed to the air. And so what we notice here is that this becomes a derived trait that is present in the mammals, lizards and snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. This is going to be a shared or derived trait that is going to be present. But notice that, again, we have a group of organisms that remains a little bit different after this point of divergence, and there is going to be other characteristics that will be appearing. For example, a new derived trait we see appearing in some of these descendants coming from this node or branching point of divergence is going to be the presence of feathers. And so feathers is going to be something that is present in ostriches, hawks, and other birds, but it's not going to be present in the other amniotes we have here. As you may know, the body for a lizard or a crocodile is going to be covered with scales, and the body of mammals is going to be covered with fur. And so this is what an evolutionary tree in the form of a phylogenetic tree will be able to show you by means of depicting those derived characteristics that are appearing and those most common recent ancestors to the nested patterns of taxonomic groups we can see here. You can begin to make inferences. You can begin to make further hypotheses about how organisms can be related by means of a common evolutionary history, or make hypotheses about how they're related because of the genetic and protein similarities or differences that they may have. And we are going to have a lab where we're going to be exploring more about phylogenetic trees, and you're going to be solidifying, strengthening your understanding you have right now of this tree view of life that began with Charles Darwin, but now we can expand using homologies, derived characteristics that are going to be shared by organisms that are hypothesized to have a shared common ancestor.